Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 1 of the Next Steps podcast from Citywide Baptist Church. This is where we are attempting, at least, to go deeper into our teaching that we do on a Sunday and talk about the next steps that we can take in our lives. Joining me today is Matt Garvin, our senior pastor at Citywide, Pastor Paul Dare, and Anne Herbert, who is a member of our teaching team. I'm Matt Henderson. I'm one of the elders at Citywide Baptist Church. And welcome. Today we're going to be discussing what we talked about on Sunday. So this podcast will contain spoilers for the sermon from yesterday, which was the 5th of September. So before you go on with this video, if you weren't tuned into us yesterday, click on the link in the description, watch that, and then come back to us. But before we get into talking about that, we've actually got some mail pertaining to last week's discussion about tithing and offerings. It's always exciting to get questions. We didn't actually think we'd be getting questions yet. We thought we'd have to do a few episodes to get questions.
And I love it, because this is what we're about. We want to work out how does this actually work. So anyone listening or watching, we'd love to get as many questions as you got, and Paul is going to answer them all.
Yeah, so if you've got questions, throw them into the comments section of our videos, or send us an email at Citywide Baptist Church. So the question is from Pete. And he says here, a question regarding tithing. What advice would you give to a person or family who believe in the principle of tithing, budget to tithe and practice tithing, and then suddenly their circumstances change, e.g. a major sickness or a loss of employment, resulting in a reduction in income and possibly an increase in expenses, which means they're no longer in a position to tithe or to tithe in the way that they intended to? What advice would you give to them? It's a great question from Pete.
And I reckon, as I said, over to you, Paul.
Yeah, Paul.
Okay, I think that this is such an easy question to answer when it doesn't affect you. If it doesn't affect you, the answer is tithe and trust God. Yeah, that's the biblical answer. When it's actually affecting you and you're living through it, it's a completely different story in your own mind, in your own heart, in the way things are happening. But if you actually stop and think about it, the amount you tithe will be different, because tithe's based on 10% of your income. That's the general principle, or 10% of income. So I actually think that the amount you tithe would be less, and you would still be tithing. And it comes back to trusting God. And it's so easy to say, from me sitting here as an outsider looking into your not knowing your circumstances fully, but I firmly believe that still you should, on what you currently get, you should still tithe the tithe. Because once again, as we talked about last week, I've heard so many stories of people who are flat down on their luck, but they continue to trust God, and God supplies their needs as opposed to their wants, their needs. And like I said, but it's between you and God. Honestly, it's between you and God, but that's what I would say.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Anne, I don't know if you had any thoughts on that.
Well, I think, as Paul says, that when you have a different circumstance, then you have to think differently about your tithing in that circumstance. And 10% is a different percentage. And I think too that you may find that if your income overall for the year, for example, is going to be reduced, then it may impact on the fact that you've already given a whole lot more before your income changed. And then that's something that can factor into how much you might then want to apply for what's left of that year, for example. I mean, if you've budgeted for a year or for 6 months, or however it works in your household. So I don't think God's unreasonable about all these things. He knows your circumstances, he knows your needs, and he will provide. We know that. because he says it, and Jesus said to his followers, don't worry about what may or may not happen tomorrow. God will help you deal with whatever hard things come when the time comes. And that's a real promise to hold on to in what are really difficult circumstances. And as Paul says, easy for somebody who isn't in your situation, or a situation of somebody who has lost income, to speak into that situation, except that we know that you can trust God. And here's another bit of scripture that's always been one that's meant a lot to me. He is an ever-present help in times of trouble. So he'll give you insight into how you manage your money in that time, and the wisdom that you need.
Yeah, I think I shared this last week. For my family, we are, by Australian standards, a low-income family, and we used to feel like we couldn't afford to give. We wanted to, but we didn't feel like we could afford it. And then there was certainly a decision made at a certain point. No, we're going to give more, even more than we actually think we can. And God just worked that out. Like we didn't miss the money. It shouldn't have really worked out, but it did. And I actually think that experience is probably shared by a lot of people in the church, if they're willing to, like Paul and Anne have said, if they're willing to trust that God is faithful. Yeah. Matt, did you have any extra thoughts on that?
Look, it's the sort of thing, as I said, one of my frustrations for me is always that we could talk for a long time about something like this. But I think Paul and Anne and you have really captured the heart of it. And it's something we need to keep talking about.
Yeah, definitely. It is important, particularly in the church in Australia. It can tend to be a very middle-class community. And sometimes we forget that we also have people in our church communities who have lower incomes. Whereas predominantly our church communities are often made up of people who have choices about what they do with their money. It's important that we're mindful of that.
Absolutely.
So moving on to this week, we started our new sermon series, the Next Steps series, maybe inspired by this podcast. Tell us about what we talked about on Sunday, Matt.
Yeah, well, they're certainly not unrelated. As we launch the Next Steps podcast, we're launching the Next Steps sermon series. And while the podcast will continue beyond the sermon series, the heart of it's still the same. We actually say in our church documents that we really want each week to be the kind of church that is encouraging people to take next steps in their relationship with God, next steps in their relationship with each other, and next steps in their relationship and understanding of themselves. This week, as we started this sermon series about what does it actually mean to take responsibility in your relationship with God, to take next steps. I felt a bit of a burden. The title of the sermon was "Let's Get Real," because I do feel a bit of a burden that there's a job we've got to do to overcome consumer Christianity, that there's a model of church that has become normal for us in the Western world that is about church is here to meet my needs, and if it makes me feel uncomfortable, then there's something wrong. Whereas actually, the picture I have is Jesus is going to continually make us uncomfortable because he's wanting us to grow. He's wanting us to become free. And so I love teaching a Bible book, and we'll do that every year, but we're going to really hone in on what does it mean to be a disciple of Jesus over these next 5 or 6 weeks, and just setting up the conversation on Sunday. And probably the central insight that I was trying to communicate with the whole message was that you don't see the world as it is. You see it as you are, and how you see the world impacts every aspect of your life, and that faith is learning to trust how God sees the world, and that how God sees the world is actually the truth, and that as we let Jesus take our hand, gradually he will actually be confronting how you see things. He will be gradually helping you grow and develop character. So I started off by talking about The Block. We watched the finale of the week last night, and it's been bewildering for me. It's a little disturbing that this woman on the TV series The Block is such a good liar. I don't know if she even knows she's lying, but she kept talking about her truth. And we live in a culture that just is all about your truth. And it really strikes me that our culture sounds a lot like the time of Judges, where it says, everyone did as they saw fit. In our culture, that's good. Doing as you see fit is what's celebrated. Doing what you don't see fit, that's not celebrated. And actually, when I was at seminary, I did a bit of work and saw how the thing of how you see the world. I did some work on that as a theme right the way through the Bible, starting with the first few chapters of Genesis and how we were given this the whole garden, but the one tree we weren't meant to grasp for was the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The idea that God's saying to us, you can trust my reality, or you can try and reach for your own. Reaching for your own is not going to end well. And we take the whole story of the Bible, and Jesus comes and says he is the revelation of God's truth. He is the light. And then ultimately, at the end of the Bible, we don't have a city lit by the sun and stars. We have a city lit by the truth of who Jesus is, and so that we end up seeing because of Jesus. And so it's a major theme of the whole Bible, but it really unpacking that. Again, I'd love to spend more time unpacking it all, but just the reality that we've emphasized in Christianity getting the right ideas. But Jesus, time and time again, said, "Look, I want you to focus on your heart, where your decisions are coming from." And I put up this picture of a tree from that I got from World Relief, is the organisation that put this out as part of. They use this tree as a model of trying to train people in communities to get past their prejudices and that they realise it's often the beliefs that are the problem. Anyway, as I saw what they were doing, I thought that's such an important truth and so I keep leaning into that tree, and so I put that up and said, look, and for the first half of the discussion, of her first half of the message, ended by throwing people to a conversation that says, look, reflect on your own life and what things in your own life have produced good fruit and what things in your own life have not produced good fruit. So there's a whole lot of other stuff I was talking about, and there's a whole lot of other stuff behind what I was talking about, but that's probably enough in terms of what we tried to do in the first half of the message.
Yeah, well, there's a lot to unpack there. Anne,
I was going to just pick up on what Matt was talking about the tree. I loved the image of the tree. I think that image of the tree and the roots is actually one that we find often in the Bible as well. And as Matt spoke yesterday, I couldn't help thinking of a couple of verses that actually mean a great deal to me. The first one was from Paul's letter to Christians at Ephesians, where he says, I pray that your roots may go down deep in love, and that you will know the fullness of Christ's love in you. And that to me that's where our beliefs, if our beliefs are rooted in Christ and his love, it makes such a difference to what that happens with the tree, if you like, and what it produces. And then the other one that came to me was, it's actually in Hebrews chapter 12, and it talks about discontent and bitterness and arguing that goes on communities, and in particular the church community. And it says, get rid of the bitter root that grows among you. And again, that's all related to the rooting yourself in love, and how it can get tainted. It can get spoiled and poisoned by bitterness and this, those kind of not, the opposite of loving, which is where Christ calls us to be. And that gets rooted. That's part of our beliefs. When we believe things that lead us into a bitter and resentful view of other people, it will show in what we do and how we behave, in our actions and so forth. And the other one is one that's in the Old Testament from Isaiah. And it actually comes after what Jesus said about himself, that he came to release people who were prisoners, and he came to make the lame to walk again, and all of these things. And it goes on to, I think that's the one, I might be mixing it up, about an oil of joy for mourning and so forth. And then he says that you may be trees of righteousness, a planting of the Lord. And that's, to me, again, it's planting ourselves in rich soil, rooted in love and the righteousness of God, for the display of his splendor. And when I think of who he is faithfulness, he is love, he is the provider, and he wants us as his people to be those things. And we can only be those things when we are rooted in Christ's love. So
Yeah,
that was for me a picture, or several pictures that came to me from what Matt was talking about yesterday.
I mean, there's so much to unpack from that, just what you've both had to say there, and goodness knows how long we're going to be here today unpacking this stuff. I want to go back to what Matt started with when he talked about that, the dangers of the consumer focused, seeker sensitive, almost focused way of doing church that we've fallen into very much in the Western world. And I think it's a conversation that needs to be had. It's an important conversation. I was just wondering, Paul, if you had any thoughts you wanted to share about that.
Yeah, one of my things over the last few years, I've become, and I've been guilty of this as myself. At one stage, I was myself thought that churches need to be seeker sensitive, and I've actually come away from that feeling because society has changed, and I think this probably goes back to two things really. The truth, which Matt talked about at the start of the sermon, and just start of today, is everybody has their own truth now. And so we live in, and this is probably the hardest thing for churches to admit, is the fact that we live in what they call a post-Christendom era. In other words, people don't grow up knowing Christ. People don't go to church as a rule because of tradition. People go to church because they have a knowledge and they want more of a knowledge, or they have a head knowledge and they want a heart knowledge of God. That's what people go to church for. And as part of that heart knowledge, you get the community, the authentic community, all that stuff. So I actually really like the idea of the getting real, the whole idea of it called getting real. I also like the idea of, and I've reflected on this, there's someone whose name I won't mention, that said a few weeks ago, oh, I only go to church for me. And it really challenged me, because the point of church is not, is it a point of church for you? Or is it a point of church about God? And I think that should influence everything we do, is because the church is not for you. The church is for God, and God will work through you while you're at church. But church is primarily there to worship God. And I that's what I come back to. And if church is there to primarily worship God, therefore it's not really seeker sensitive. It's got to be more godly focused, if that makes sense.
It reminds me very much, there was a funny meme that I came across this week, actually, on a Facebook group that I'm a part of for people who are creatives for their church. And it was a a funny little thing where of a person saying, I did not like the worship today. And the person responding to them said, that's okay, we weren't worshiping you. And I thought, well, that's great. So Matt, you touched on this idea that we all have beliefs, but that they don't always necessarily align with the Bible. They don't always necessarily align with what God wants. Do you want to elaborate on that a bit? Like, you had some interesting things to say about how people live in their echo chambers today and stuff like that. I thought was really interesting.
Yeah, well, I think this is part of the core question. Like, at the moment, we're having these discussions about different beliefs. I've actually got a quote here that I was wondering about using, but I didn't, from a climate scientist. And he said, I used to think that the top environmental problems were biodiversity loss, ecosystem collapse, and climate change. I thought that 30 years of good science could address these problems. I was wrong. The top environmental problems are selfishness, greed, and apathy. And to deal with these, we need a cultural and spiritual transformation. And we scientists don't know how to do that. And I think part of what I'm challenged by, I also don't know how well we in the church know how to do that. In that it's one thing to deliver a service that reinforces people and help them feel good in how they currently see the world. But at the foundation of how I see the world, there is truth, but there is also stuff that's not true. And there's a whole lot of stuff I'm missing. And I don't know the difference. I feel as much integrity when I'm coming from truth as when I'm coming from something that's not true. And I feel at the same level of discomfort when I'm doing something that is, even though I'm coming from something that's, when I'm working against what is true, then when I'm feeling, it's interesting talking to people. Like for me, I had to confront my own racism when I went to Indonesia, and it was uncomfortable. And I had to face my prejudices about Indonesia. And I find that God just keeps taking me to places where I have to face my prejudices, where I have to face my wrong beliefs. And that actually is the deep work that is at the heart of the gospel. I think that's what Paul means when he says, when the church is doing its work, people are becoming mature, that they're aligning their beliefs with what is actually true, and learning how to cope with the fact that there is a part of them that is messy. And yeah, so look, there's a whole lot of layers to it. But as I look around the church, I don't look around a bunch of people who've got it together. I look around a bunch of people who are as messy as anybody else out in the world. But hopefully we've got language to talk about that. And too often we haven't. We've somehow smuggled in this idea that as a Christian, you've got to have it together, which is serious in my view.
Yeah, and also we've very much, a lot of people seem to have this idea that it's right to feel comfortable at church, and I think it's actually right to challenge that belief.
Can I just, I was actually going to leave this for the end of the podcast, but I've got to say it now because you've just challenged me. Thanks, Matt. And we're talking about discomfort and discord and probably more discomfort in the church. Yeah, I was listening to the intro to this podcast, and I just don't know why we didn't acknowledge country in it. And it made me feel really uncomfortable when I actually listened to it. But I was going to mention it afterwards on the quiet. But I actually think to show that how real we are as a church, I actually think I need to bring it up now. So I am bringing it up now. We need to acknowledge country. We just talked about racism and feeling uncomfortable, and yet we didn't do it. And you go, why? And
you see, that's a classic example, because it comes from, not because of people are making moral decisions not to do it necessarily, but from our blindness. Like, it comes from how we see the world, and that we're on this journey. Like, it was important for me to face the history in Tassie a bit and read some of that stuff, but I'm only glimpsing it. And we live out of the truth we see. We can't live out of anything else. And so we actually need to face stuff. And so I'm with you, mate. It didn't occur to me. That's what we're talking about.
This is the other problem, isn't it? That we all have a way of seeing the moment we're living in that is not seeing the full picture. And we're very complacent. We can tend to be very complacent about what we think we see as opposed to what actually is.
And Paul, wouldn't it be true for you that you've had to take a journey with coming to terms with your own Aboriginal history and your own beliefs about it?
It's so true. Like, what I believe and what I see now is so different to what I did 10 years ago. And it is such a, for me, actually acknowledging it is, and this is one of these things, like acknowledging the truth is actually freeing. And that's what I found, it's freeing. So, yeah.
And so somehow the church has to be a place we all acknowledge we see partially, and that our knowledge is growing and changing, but at the same time we hold on to truth, knowing as best we can what we can, that it is our understanding of even who God is so partial that we don't want to. There's somehow some sort of humility that's needed, but also we need to be able to take the journey to hang on to the stuff that is really important and not to throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Well, thank you, Paul, for drawing our attention to it now and not at the end. And that's good. And I'm sorry that we didn't acknowledge the country and the people who are our First Nation.
Absolutely.
And I was thinking in regard to seeing the world from our viewpoint. It's right, we do that, and we can be looking at the same thing, and we'll see it. We'll take from what we see or touch or experience different things, and all of those things can be real. They can be. And I've got this vague memory of an Indian story or a proverb or something about how there were three blind people, maybe it was a story, and they were each touching different parts of an elephant. And based on what they were touching and experiencing, that was what they thought an elephant was. So maybe one was touching the trunk, another was touching the flank, and another, I don't know, the ear. And so their understanding and their definition, and so they were arguing about what an elephant was, when in fact they were all right, but none of them were right, because they all had hold of part of the truth. And it's always been something that's been in my mind, that when I see the world in a certain way, and my understandings are not necessarily everything there is about whatever it is I understand. And so I find it hard to see the world in black and white. And I find it hard sometimes to relate to people who do. Because I think, okay, so that's how they see it. And maybe if I was looking at it from their point of view, I'd see it the same way. Or coming at it from their set of experiences through their life, I wouldn't have a different view from what they've had, kind of thing. And so I always, it makes me second guess myself sometimes. Now, maybe that can be an issue, but anyway, that's just where I come from sometimes. I do find shades of grey more like what's real in the world than black and white, and I question black and white sometimes. So, yeah. And I think empathy. Sorry, Mike, I was going to say one more thing. Empathy. We talked about empathy a few times in different sermons, which is about being able to step into somebody else's world. And maybe perspective, other points of view, is part of what we need to be able to do. I don't know how we do that without losing a sense of what is an ultimate truth. I mean, some people would say there is no ultimate truth, as you talked about, Matt.
I think that's the thing, though, and we talk about black and whites and greys, and I think when you understand there's grey in the world, that's when you start having empathy, because you go, all right, this is the way I see it. Oh, but they see it this way and they see it that way. So you go, oh, we've got all these different viewpoints about how we see things. And I think it comes down to in our human world, there's very few black and whites. And the black and whites we have to rely on are those that God give us. I think they're the ones we have to rely on, is our God-given truths. There's certain things that he says is black and white. It's a bit like our take on sin is a classic. Like to us, we have degrees of sin. God has one level of sin, but we still want to put degrees on in our world, and that's the way we make ourselves comfortable with the little sins in the world, I think, rather than necessarily admitting that it's all sin. And I think, as we take these next steps and being real, we need to understand that church will be messy, as Matt calls it, be very messy, because everyone has their own version of human truths. I'll put that label on it, human truth, which creates all these greys and blacks and whites in the church. But we've still got to hold on to the God-given truth, which is that there is a black and white truth there, and we've just got to admit that we are just imperfect. And how do we deal with it?
I do remember when I was a teenager, and I was probably too much of a teenager to appreciate the advice when it was given to me. But when I was a teenager, my dad pulling me aside and saying to me, "Kiddo, when you disagree with God, you're always wrong." And that's really uncomfortable to think about. But actually, it's true, isn't it? I mean, as Matt's talked about, we've all got things in our belief system that actually are things we have to repent of.
It is, but this is the challenge, because the God he has in his head when he's saying that is different to the God you have in your head when you're saying that.
Oh, sure.
This is where it gets to the nub of the problem. And this is what I was trying to communicate a bit on Sunday. I want to spend a lot more time communicating that there is reality.
Yes.
And we hit it. And our dysfunction and our sin, and we hit reality at point blank range, and it produces either life or death, And so there are parts of our life that are alive and growing and producing holy, healthy, fun, full, life-giving relationship, and there are parts of our life that aren't. And so I think there are what I was trying to do on Sunday is point the direction to becoming aware of where the fruit is good and where it's not, but also the Bible. And what's been so important for me, because all sorts of, going to seminary, you learn that there's all kinds of theological debates about, does God really mean this or that? And you'll say there are points where the Bible's not clear, but ultimately the Bible grounds everything in Jesus.
Yeah.
And he is the fixed point. He is the plumb line, the cornerstone, and he is always challenging. That as I hold my life up to him, I see plenty of rough edges. And even if I'm only holding myself up to what I can currently see of him, that's enough. But what I love is God didn't send a theology, he sent a person into history, and he becomes the focal point, the fixed point, the black and white truth that we have to engage with. And it's probably, what I find interesting is that most of our debates happen not so much about who Jesus is and his teaching, but other bits of the Bible, other pieces of often systematic theology that we fight over. So there is this fixed point, but it is awkward, and so and it does ask something. So both the reality testing and being able to look at our own behaviour and seeing what fruit, because all of us have lives that are a mixture of good and bad, that produce health and unhealth, but also as the Hebrew says, fixing our eyes on Jesus, you start to realise there is a fixed point there. There's a point from where reality comes, and I think for me, I've had to ground it, because when I hear so many people arguing about what God says, that I've discovered that for me and for others, even God becomes a reflection of my own desires, and that word becomes something I project myself onto. It's a lot harder to project yourself onto Jesus, because he's a person, and he's anyway, so I'll stop rabbiting on.
We do have there are a lot of, it's something that you hear sometimes, isn't it? People talk about my God, and it's a dangerous thing, because they're reading their own stuff into God.
Absolutely.
So tell us about what you moved on to in the second half of the message, Matt.
Well, I mean, I kind of just did, in that we looked at the what Paul talks about in the book of Galatians, the fruit of the Spirit, but also the other side of things, and that Jesus, this passage in Isaiah where God says, "I'm going to place a plumb line in Jerusalem, a cornerstone," and Jesus is often referred to as the cornerstone. The cornerstone is the place where everything else is measured, but he's also referred to as the stumbling block, the one over you trip over him. You can try and make other things sound good and whatever, but you trip over him. And I think what I was trying to do is to help people get to a point of honesty. I want to help myself get to a point of honesty where I can face that. I've been a pastor for 10 years or so. I was in ministry for 20 years before that, but I've still got so much messy stuff in my life that I'm not real proud of, and all of us do. But there's also a beautiful part that is created in the image of God, and that gradually, as I hang around more with Jesus, I gradually grow. I was hoping, that's the second part of the message was, again, bouncing off the tree diagram that I'd introduced, that this is the journey of growth, learning to more and more align my beliefs with the truth of who Jesus is. And I think I was wanting to make clear that it's not a simple journey, and I'm sure there are plenty of people who turn up in church every Sunday for whom it's not a journey they're engaged with at all.
Let's throw that tree diagram up and have a talk about it.
No worries. I think I can do that. Now, obviously, for those listening on the podcast, and we're hoping that the majority of people will be listening on the podcast, you won't be able to see it. But it's basically, I don't know, Matt, do you want to describe it?
Sure. So Matt's got a tree here. It's got its roots down the bottom. It's got and that the roots are called what I believe is true. And then we've got the trunk of the tree, and there's a little arrow that says values, what I think is best. The branches have been labeled actions, what I do. And then we've got the results, which is the fruit. That diagram's in the sermon notes, isn't it? Yeah. So people will be able to find that in the link to the sermon notes.
So part of the reason I was wanting to do this is just to help us, and very intentionally, the fruit is different coloured. And I know, like, it's interesting, even looking at I think there are aspects in which I was a good dad. There's also aspects in which my kids carry scars because I was full of myself. And both are me. I had someone, Pete, send another email. He's saying, well, yeah, you can see how beliefs really matter, but what about your sin nature? The Bible says the things I want to do, I don't do. The things I don't want to do, I do. Well, this is where, for me, this is so central. One of the wrong beliefs we can have is that we, as a Christian, should have it all together, and we shouldn't have a messy side. We shouldn't have a dark side. Aligning your beliefs with reality is aligning the truth of the Bible, that grace means you are loved despite the fact you're messy, and also being able to be honest with, like, there are times where I'm much more interested in how people see me than communicating the truth of God. There are times where I'm much more interested in watching TV than loving my wife or my kids. And I'm not proud of that. And I don't need you to fix me up, because, I don't need emails from people worried about me, because I also know something about everybody else. It's true of everybody. That there's two sides to all of us. And that's what I mean by aligning your right beliefs. You actually, most of us don't have adequate beliefs. And in our modern society, we kind of fall into the trap of thinking you've got to be true to yourself. But we don't have any nuance into terms of, is that your sick self or your healthy self? And usually it's a mixture of both. And so your beliefs come from both places, and they produce your values, which you think is best. And then and that's what produces your actions. And then we fight over the results. But the results are always the last thing that's the problem.
And did you have a response to the tree diagram?
Oh, well, I've already talked a bit about it, but I'll talk about it again, because it seems to me, coming back to those two verses that I mentioned earlier on about putting your roots down in love and getting rid of the bitter root, is that, and I guess the bitter root has its own kind of fruit, if you like, by the time you get to it. So it will, sort of shape values, it will shape your actions, and then that will produce certain outcomes. It could be anger, an anger root, or but I don't know if that's about belief. But I guess the belief is in something that causes the bitterness or the anger to emerge. I don't know, maybe I'm getting a bit mixed up, but the other thought that I've got, and it's another little picture in my mind. I saw a TV program on one occasion, and it's by a guy who was a bonsai expert, and he was showing how to shape and prune back a tree, a bonsai tree that needed a bit of reshaping to be all that it could be. And I looked at it and I thought, oh, that looks really nice the way it is. And then he set to work cutting all this stuff out, and he really went to town. He cut here and he cut there, and then he'd look back and he'd come back in and cut a bit more. And he even went right down into the branch system. It wasn't just leaves he was cutting off. And he looked at the trunk, and he said, well, if I cut this branch right here at the trunk, it will be okay here. And he did work there. And then he actually did work around the roots of this bonsai tree. And he said, and the art of bonsai is to display the roots, and the way the roots, and you bring the roots to look to the most advantage that you can, because the roots are really important to the tree. And it was just this, and by the time he'd finished, and he said, and we'll just move this root here, and we'll shape it there, and maybe do a bit of a tweak here with this root. And by the end of it, the tree was transformed. And I thought this looked nice before, but here it was, and it looked amazing. And he absolutely brought out the shape and structure of the branches and the trunk and the roots. And he was a master bonsai artist, if you like. And I think of my God as the master bonsai artist for me and for you when you trust your life to Jesus. And Jesus himself said, I am the vine. He didn't say I'm the tree, but he could have. I am the vine and you are the branch. And so if you like, he's the trunk, and when we ground ourselves in him and his roots of love and selflessness and love for our neighbours and that kind of approach to life. And our actions, the branches, our actions reflect Christ values and Christ love. And then that shows the fruit that Matt talked about in Galatians yesterday. So yeah, so for me, there's a lovely picture there, and sometimes we need pruning. And that's where you talked about discipline yesterday, Matt.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we spend a lot of time as not just in a church community, but in our broader community as well, where we spend a lot of our time just looking at the branches and just looking at the fruit that people are producing, but not actually seeing anything deeper than that. Paul, how do we deal with that particular challenge when we're trying to build a healthy church community?
I think it comes back to what Matt says. You know, people said you've got to be true to yourself, and I was actually thinking about that. And I think you do have to be true to yourself in the fact that you have to be honest with yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you're actually honest with yourself, and this is really, really hard generally, but most of the time you're doing it anyway. The sin in your life is obvious. The bad fruit is obvious. If you're actually honest with yourself, you can see where your beliefs come from if you are honest with yourself. And so you have to be true to yourself, because it's only when you're true to yourself do you actually understand where your beliefs come from. So I get this bit of a circular argument going in my head, which is always interesting. But if you're not true to yourself, you'll never understand your motives. You'll never understand your beliefs. You'll never understand exactly where you're going wrong and right, according to what God has for you and God's desire for us to live it. And I think as a church, and this is the other thought that was going through my head as Matt was speaking before, was as a church, it's a really strange struggle inside, because to me, God is screaming, why don't we just do it? And other people are going, I don't want to do that, and it's just, I don't know how to balance it, Matt. I honestly don't know how to do it. All I know is it's going to be messy. And as a church, if we embrace God fully, let's be honest, if we embrace God fully as a church, people will fall away, others will come, and we will look different, just like the master bonsai person. We will look different. But I suppose it's up to everybody just to be willing to actually do that. And that's, how do we get a church willing to do that? That's the challenge. That's the challenge for all churches all over the world. And I don't have an answer, Matt.
No, and for me, it's how do I get myself willing to do it? And it's a day by day, moment by moment question for each one of us. And kind of what I'm wanting to help our people see at the moment is that there's all kinds of forces wanting to use them as marketing tools or to get them into ways of thinking. But somehow we've got to learn to take responsibility for our own lives. And like you say, mate, just own ourselves. And a whole lot of our beliefs we're not even conscious of. They're subconscious. And it's only as we can start to admit, well, that bit of my life's not working so well. And it's often to do with it's the external things you can see. So you can see your health, and often there'll be things you can see in your health that's not so good, or there'll be things in your relationships, or and as I look to Jesus, it's another point of reference. But I don't know if you can get a church to get to a point where everybody is fully sold out to God. I'd love to believe that was true.
I don't think we'll ever get there either. No,
not this side of eternity, but I do believe that for each one of us, there'll be moments, and every day it is, for me, it's a choice every day, and I don't always make it, which is a scary thing to say as a pastor, but sometimes I'm full of myself. Sometimes I'm full of crap. And I need to be able to, I think I need a church where I can be honest about that. And I need mates who know me well enough, who know me when I'm full of crap. I don't know if I'm allowed to say crap on a podcast. I think it's slightly easier to say that on a podcast than when I'm preaching. But
we'll find out. We'll find out when we get the get the mail.
But that's the stuff. we need a fellowship of people who know that they are both beautiful and messy. And both of those parts of them are part of the conversation. And that somehow Jesus is also part of the conversation as an external reference point. And the unhealthy fruit and the healthy fruit, the healthy fruit gets reinforced and the unhealthy fruit gets pruned and pointed out sometimes.
But it's also acceptance too. I think we need to be more accepting of others. Like one of my journey is through mental health issues is I never used to talk about it. I would never admit that I was mentally not having a good day. But now I do. And some people look at me really weird and other people go, oh, that's really cool. So it's accepting in yourself that you're having a bad day. And it's others accepting around you that, oh, they're having a bad day. That's okay. And that's a whole messy community, isn't it? It's a whole being able to be honest in that community, and people don't have to solve your problems. They just have to walk beside you and grow with you. And that's where it's at.
Preacher.
But I mean, there is something so powerful about that. Whether it's a mental health issue or whatever it is, the ability for someone to be able to be honest about where they're at, own it and acknowledge it, and to be accepted for being where they're at. That's where you get to real community.
Yep.
So, Matt, I was wondering if it was possible for you to give us a little sneak peek at what we're going to be talking about next Sunday.
Yeah, well, I'm hoping between here and there to have some little cards printed out with this tree diagram on it, but also the model that we'll be talking about. Because we're basically going to talk about how there really are 5 things to be thinking about on the journey of discipleship. And next week we'll be talking about, like, it's not rocket science. None of this is complicated, and everybody already knows it, but it's just sort of making it visible. That in order to actually be a follower of Jesus, he actually needs to be a focus. Again, like I said, not rocket science, except that what it means is we actually need to hang out with him. We need to spend time reading about him. He actually needs to be a point of reference in our lives, more than our Facebook feed or the whatever Princess Harry and Meghan are doing at the moment, or what's happening with just in this world of sport or on the block, or we get so much other, dare I say, crap bombarding us that and most of us feel so time poor that we have to make some choices to actually focus on Jesus, and more than just on the hour and a half on Sunday morning. So that's what we talk about next week. What does it mean to actually focus on Jesus, and for that to be the ground from which we live our lives? And then we'll be talking about, over the coming weeks, what does it mean to create space to reflect, to actually do this kind of work we were talking about, where you stop and think, what does it mean for me to stop and listen and look at the fruit of my life and work out how do I do that? What does it mean to recognize the truth? What does it mean then to choose differently than I currently am choosing? And what does it mean to actually do it, to act, not just talk about it? So that's the general trajectory over the next 5 or 6 weeks. But next week it really is focusing on Jesus.
Can I just say something? And I know we're probably needing to draw things to a close. And I wanted to pick up a little bit on Pete's question, and also on comments that Matt Garvin and Paul Dare made in relation to we're messy, and we can know the truth of Jesus, and we can focus on Jesus, but we still stuff up and do things that we wish we hadn't done, and all of the rest of it, and make life difficult for those around us, and feel a bit like failures sometimes in our walk with Christ and all the rest of it. And I think there's someone who we haven't talked about yet, and that is the Holy Spirit, the Spirit of God. Jesus promised when he said, I have to go so that the Spirit can come
Mm.
and be, because we cannot do this on our own. We cannot rise above our own view of the world. We cannot rise above our own mess without the insights and the power of the Holy Spirit at work within us and being open to his Spirit working in us. And I wanted to just, I'm going to read it because I haven't memorized it or anything, but it is a very special verse, and it's in Romans 12, and it gets to this thing about we're constantly stuffing up. We do what we don't want to do. We don't do what we'd like to do, and so forth. And it's this call by Paul to say, keep renewing. It's by the renewing, the constant renewing of your mind, transforming your mind to become more like Jesus. And it is the Spirit of God that enables us to do that. And it's from Romans 12. Therefore, this is what I want you to do, God helping you. Take your everyday, ordinary life, your sleeping, eating, going to work, and walking around life, and place it before God as an offering. Embracing what God does for you is the best thing you can do for him. Don't become so well adjusted to your culture that you fit into it without even thinking. Instead, fix your attention on God. You'll be changed from the inside out. Readily recognize what he wants from you and quickly respond to it. Unlike the culture around you, always dragging you down to its level of immaturity, God brings the best out of you, develops well-formed maturity in you. And another way of saying that would be, be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, the truth of God. So I just wanted, that was something that I wanted leave as my parting comment.
I think it's a great place to end us on. So I want to thank Matt, Paul, and Anne for joining me today, and thank everyone who's listening. This has been the Next Steps podcast. Please, if you enjoyed listening, rate the podcast, like it, share it. Please, we want as many people to listen as possible. And please send us your questions. We love questions. And thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next week.